Childhood is often remembered as a time of innocence, but it can also be profoundly confusing. You're surrounded by rules you didn't create and expectations you don't fully understand, and adults who seem to know exactly how the world works. You're told that everything has a reason, yet those reasons are rarely explained to you. Looking back, it's easy to forget just how strange the world once felt. And perhaps that is why Alice in Wonderland continues to resonate decades after its release. Even 70 years later, beneath its colourful animation and eccentric characters is a story that captures the confusion with remarkable honesty. But to understand why Disney's adaptation feels so different from almost every other animated classic, we first need to go back to the book that started it all. Before we get into the meanings and everything of the Disney version, I think it's important to talk about where it originally came from. This beauty here is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the additional story Through the Looking Glass. Of course, I spent money on the additional cloth-bound version because that's who I am. And this was very strange how it started. Lewis Carroll was going over the River Thames, talking to three young girls, telling them an improvised fantasy story. And one of the girls, known as Alice, loved it, said he should write it down. And he wrote it down and kind of just expanded on that world as he went on. And the reason this was strange at the time was because Victorian stories often were there to teach moral lessons, how to treat your family, how to work, and how to behave. And this was essentially just an acid trip before an acid trip. So let's take a look at where we went from there. For years, the main criticism against Alice in Wonderland has been that it's just random. Characters appear without warning and conversations drift into nonsense, and then seem to exist for no reason. And unlike most Disney films, there's no clear destination, there's no evil witch, no princess, there's no central villain driving the narrative, and very little that resembles a traditional story structure, beginning, middle, and end. On the surface, it's easy to understand why people can come away with that impression. Every year I revisit this film, and I don't believe the randomness is the right word for it, because randomness suggests the absence of order. It implies that events happen without intention or meaning, yet the longer Alice spends in Wonderland, the more obvious it becomes that every character operates according to their own set of rules. The problem isn't that there are no rules, it's that none of them are ever shared. Take perhaps the second most identifiable thing, the White Rabbit. His entire existence revolves around time. Every decision he makes is dictated by his schedules and the fear of being late. Caterpillar, on the other hand, couldn't seem less interested in time. Instead, his attention is fixed on identity and challenging Alice with questions she isn't equipped to answer. Each of these characters makes perfect sense within their own worldview. They're not behaving irrationally, they're behaving according to a logic that Alice doesn't understand. And that's where discomfort begins. If she can just ask the right questions and behave politely, everything will eventually make sense. Every encounter teaches her the opposite. Just as she starts to understand one situation, she's thrown into another. It's an exhausting way to exist, and the film wants us to feel that exhaustion alongside her. There's very little time to settle into one location before the story moves on. Conversations rarely end with the understanding. Questions are met with more questions, even language itself becomes unreliable, twisted into riddles, puns and contradictions that leave Alice more confused than when she started. Perhaps that's why Wonderland feels unsettling, not because it's chaotic, but because it's fragmented. It's a world where everyone believes they're making perfect sense, yet no one is speaking the same language, at least not philosophically. Every character is certain they're right, while Alice is left trying to navigate a reality where certainty itself is impossible. What makes Wonderland so frustrating isn't simply that its rules keep changing, it's that Alice is never given the opportunity to understand them before she's judged for breaking them. Throughout the film, she approaches almost every encounter with the same quiet optimism. She's polite, curious, and genuinely wants to understand the strange world she's found herself in, rather than forcing her own way of thinking onto others. She asks questions, apologises when she believes she's made a mistake, and tries to adapt to whatever situation she's facing, and yet it never seems to matter in the end of it. Every conversation places Alice at an immediate disadvantage. Before she's able to make sense of one interaction, someone interrupts her and dismisses her thoughts, or they change the subject entirely. The Mad Hatter responds to straightforward questions with riddles that refuse to be solved. The Caterpillar challenges her sense of identity rather than offering guidance. Even the flowers, who initially appear welcoming, quickly turn hostile simply because Alice isn't what they expected her to be. The pattern soon becomes impossible to ignore. Alice isn't being tested on her intelligence or her courage, she's being judged according to expectations that were never explained in the first place. It's a subtle but important distinction here. Most stories reward their protagonists for learning the rules of the world. Once they understand how things work, they're able to overcome whatever obstacle stands before them. Alice in Wonderland refuses to offer that comfort. Every lesson Alice believes she's learnt becomes useless the moment she meets someone new. Understanding one character does nothing to prepare her for the next because everyone inhabits their own completely different reality. In many ways, Wonderland begins to resemble childhood itself. As children, we're constantly expected to understand social rules that no one ever sits us down to explain. Adults tell us how to behave, but what counts as good behaviour often changes depending on who's making the rules. One teacher will encourage curiosity and another will see it as rude. One adult praises confidence and another calls it disrespectful. The expectations shift from person to person, leaving us to navigate a maze of contradictions with very little guidance throughout it. Alice experiences the same uncertainty at every turn. She's trying to satisfy people who have no interest in helping her succeed with her plan. They don't explain themselves because there's no perspective, there's nothing to explain. Their version of reality is so self-evident that Alice's confusion becomes her problem rather than theirs. And that's what gives Wonderland its quiet sense of unease. It isn't populated by monsters or villains lurking in the shadows. Instead, it's filled with people who are utterly convinced that their own perspective is the only one that matters. Alice isn't threatened by violence nearly as often as she's threatened by indifference, by a world that never pauses long enough to consider whether she's been given a fair chance to understand it. And perhaps that's a far more familiar fear than any fairy tale monster. It's the feeling of entering a room where everyone else seems to know rules except you, and no matter how hard you try to catch up, the conversation has moved on 3 ways. As the great film progresses, it becomes clear that Alice isn't searching for a way to conquer Wonderland. She's searching for something much simpler, an explanation, some reassurance that beneath all the absurdity, there's a pattern waiting to be discovered. But the reassurance is never there. Instead, every attempt to understand Wonderland only reveals another contradiction. Logic bends to suit whoever happens to be speaking, and language loses its ability to communicate anything sincere. And even the most basic questions are met with riddles, jokes, or complete indifference. The deeper Alice ventures into this strange world, the further she drifts from certainty. What's fascinating is that the film never presents this as a problem to be solved. There isn't a hidden truth waiting at the end of the journey, nor a wise mentor who eventually explains how everything fits together. Wonderland simply exists on its own terms, completely uninterested in whether Alice understands it or not. That's a surprisingly unusual idea, especially for a children's film of the time. We're used to stories that promise understanding no matter how confusing the journey becomes. The ending usually rewards both the protagonist and the audience with clarity. The mystery will be solved and the villain will be slain, and the world finally makes sense again. It's a comforting formula that we're familiar with because it reassures us of what we want. This film or story, however, offers no such promise. Instead, it suggests that confusion isn't always something to overcome. Sometimes it's simply part of existing in a world that's bigger and stranger than we can comprehend. The idea of this story taking place in a dream makes this a lot more interesting. Dreams do never follow a coherent narrative. We accept impossible events without question and move effortlessly from one location to another and meet people who behave as though they've always known us. It's only after we wake up that we begin searching for meaning, trying to impose logic on something that was never concerned with being logical in the first place. That's exactly what audiences have been doing with Alice in Wonderland for decades, calling it random and searching for hidden meanings, or trying to map out the geography of Wonderland as though it's a place that can be understood. But maybe that's missing the point. Maybe Wonderland isn't asking to be explained, and it should be left unknown. And the film keeps being so enduring because it doesn't reassure us that every question has an answer. Instead, it reminds us that some of the most defining moments in our lives are those where certainty slips away, forcing us to keep moving forward without fully understanding where we're going or what lies ahead of us. Do now think it's important to look at the characters of Wonderland, and once you stop looking at them as just wacky characters, they begin to feel like something else. Each one embodies a different response to a world that refuses to make complete sense, and together they form a collective of personalities that Alice is forced to navigate rather than just observe. The White Rabbit is the easiest to understand. He's consumed by time, forever rushing from one obligation to the next, terrified of falling behind. His anxiety is entirely self-inflicted, yet it's so overwhelming that it dictates every decision he makes. Alice follows him because he appears to know where he's going, only to discover that certainty and direction aren't the same thing for him. Next up, we've got the caterpillar. He represents a different kind of uncertainty. While everyone else tells Alice what to do, he asks a much more uncomfortable question. Who are you? It's a deceptively simple question, but one Alice can't answer. Throughout the film, she's constantly changing, sometimes literally big to small, and her identity feels just as unstable as the world around her. Rather than forcing her to find answers, the caterpillar forces her to confront the possibility she doesn't know herself like she thought she did. And then we've got the Mad Hatter and the March Hare, characters who seem completely detached from reality, yet beneath their absurdity is a strange sense of routine. They're trapped in the same conversation at the same table, repeating the same rituals day after day, it's almost as though they become prisoners of habit, finding comfort in repetition even when it no longer serves a purpose. Their world has stopped moving and they can carry on regardless. And finally, the infamous Queen of Hearts, arguably the closest thing the film has to a villain. But even she isn't evil in the traditional Disney sense. She's irrational, impulsive, and constantly changing her mind. Her authority doesn't come from wisdom or fairness, it comes from her own fear. Everyone obeys her, not because they respect her, because nobody can predict what she'll do next. In a film built around uncertainty, Queen becomes its most extreme expression, power without consistency. From all these characters, what's remarkable is that Alice never defeats any of them. She doesn't change their minds, expose their flaws, or teach them a lesson. She simply passes through the worlds, trying to understand each one before being swept into the next encounter. That's probably the point. Wonderland isn't filled with obstacles designed to overcome, it's filled with perspectives, different ways of thinking, living, and understanding reality, which is important even in the real world. Some of these people are anxious, some are authoritarian, some just seem to be endless philosophical ideas, and others are content to embrace complete absurdity. Alice's journey isn't about deciding what one is correct, it's about learning that the world is full of people whose minds works nothing like her own. And that's potentially the strangest lesson Alice in Wonderland has to offer. Growing up isn't about finally making sense of the world, it's about realising that everyone is making sense of it in their own way, even when those ways seem completely incompatible. So let's try and wrap this up, because I'm sure at this point you're sick of hearing my voice. It's very easy to dismiss Alice in Wonderland as a collection of strange characters and weird events. And even today, a lot of people describe it as one of Disney's most bizarre films, as though its dreamlike structure somehow makes it incomplete or difficult to understand. But I get the impression we've been asking the wrong questions. Maybe the goal was never to understand it at all. After all, Alice leaves the same way she entered, without every answer, without neatly solving every mystery. It just changes the world around her. Yet she isn't the same person. She's experienced a place where certainty doesn't exist, where every encounter challenges the way she thinks, and where trying to force order onto chaos only leads to more confusion. In the sense of that, Wonderland isn't really a destination, it's a state of mind. A reflection of those moments in life where everything feels familiar but strange, when the rules seem to change without warning, and when the only thing you can do is keep moving forward, hoping that clarity will eventually return to you. And that's probably the reason why the film has remained so enduring, not because it gives us answers, but because it understands something many stories don't. That growing up isn't about learning all the rules, it's about learning to live with the fact that not every question has one. And more than 70 years later, that's what makes Alice in Wonderland feel just as magical, just as unsettling, and just as wonderfully human as it did in 1951. And it's probably why Wonderland has continued to inspire artists, even generations later. Beneath its colourful surface lies a world that's surprisingly easy to reinterpret through a darker lens and shifting logic. A distorted sense of identity and an unpredictable inhabitant already possesses this uncanny valley quality that later creators have simply brought to the forefront, such as Tim Burton's more gothic interpretation, or what I consider a great game, the haunting imagery of American McGee's Alice. These versions don't abandon the spirit of Lewis Carroll's world, they amplify something that was always there, the somewhat horror of it. And because that world has never just been whimsical, it's unsettling, and it's uncertain. And perhaps that's exactly why it continues to capture our imagination, more than 150 years after one of the greatest books ever written was written. So, thank you for watching, and if you're not, please consider subscribing. For the people who do watch, I'm sorry my uploads aren't very sporadic. Between working and just family life, it's difficult to get a video out as often, but I will keep trying, and I do have several in the works at this point. So yeah, thank you, and I'll see you next time.